Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope you had a lovely weekend. It's good to see all of you. As you know, we are discussing industrialization strategies and development strategies, approaches that countries take to try to stimulate development. And again, we're conceiving of development in terms of improvements in health, in education, and literacy, but also in terms of individual income. We're thinking in terms of those categories that we began the class studying. And so far, we have discussed import substitution industrialization, and we talked about the policies that go hand in hand with that approach. But we also talked about sort of the undoing of that model and the precise reasons why it began to fall apart in the 70s and the 80s. This discussion is really important for us because we begin to see in real time how politics affects economics and how economics affects politics. And this week, we begin to pivot and cover the next industrialization or development strategy. It's really more of a development strategy because ISI industrialized most of these countries, but neoliberal economics and neoliberal reform is the next development strategy. And neoliberalism has to be understood as a response to the perceived limitation of ISI and some of the shortcomings of that model. And so we're going to analyze it that way. And we'll be thinking about those theoretical components, but also thinking about interests and ideas and thinking about how politics affects economics and vice versa. Now, before we get started, I do want to apologize to you. I intended to complete and post the review guide on Friday, but it was a very long day in my office hours were booked solid, and I wasn't really able to finish it before the evening caught up. And so I'm going to be posting that today. The exam is on Friday. What I do promise you is that the review guide will be similar in content to the exam. As a reminder, the exam will consist of multiple choice and true false, as well as short answer. And it's designed to be completable in 50 minutes. So it won't be a long exam, but it will cover all of the material from the first half of the course. We'll talk more about that on Wednesday, but you can look for that review guide later today. And I can, of course, address any questions that come up on Wednesday as you begin preparing for the exam on Friday. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I think the best way for us to get started today is by talking about ISI and trying to get to the bottom of it. Remember that I asked you what are the most important political, economic, and social consequences of ISI? A related question is, when it comes to the collapse of this model and the fallout and the sort of failure of the policy, what really caused the failure? Is it a matter of bad policy? Was state ownership and state credit and tariffs imposed on exports and imports, were these policies to blame for ISI's apparent shortcomings? Or are the political actors themselves culpable and responsible for the collapse of the model? Those unions and nationalistic politicians and political parties who stimulated the creation of these social classes that then upheld the model despite clear evidence of its shortcomings. What do you think? Do you think that ISI was a matter of bad politics or a matter of bad policy?
If I had to say, I would say it's more of bad politics. because I think the basis for it is good, right? Like it's trying to make certain things cheaper and make certain products more affordable for the average consumer. But as you said, the social classes that are created upend the bad parts of it, which then lead it to fail.
Yeah, interesting comment, Max. So the basic idea of stimulating consumption, putting money in people's pockets, or at least making products available to them domestically, what's wrong with that, right? And arguably, other development strategies would have a similar objective. So what's so arguable about that? And maybe those social classes and the way that they kind of cling to the system and maybe reinforce some of the limitations, maybe that really has more to do with the drawbacks of the system. That's one perspective, absolutely. And I'd like to hear from more of you though too. And what are some other angles or some perspectives that you could take? Does anyone, for example, think that ISI is a matter of bad policy, or does anyone agree that it was a matter of bad politics? Rady says, considering politicians are the ones creating policies, the failure of ISI can be attributed to them as well. Interesting. Other ideas?
I think it's also bad politics just because the fact that they discourage exporting is I don't know, that's kind of like the downside, I would say, of ISI.
So, Karen, that's certainly a downside, right? Because we know that the Asian countries, they did not discourage exports, although they did discourage imports. But do you think that tariffs are an example of bad politics or bad policy? Do you think that maybe tariffs are a policy, but that there are political motivations that lead politicians to protect certain industries? So I'll give you the example of Argentina. And the example of Argentina is probably the most important example of this conflict because we know that in the 19 teens, Argentina was a very rich country because of their exports of cattle and beef and grain. Argentina faced a choice after the onset of the Great Depression. And that choice was, do we throw up barriers to trade and develop domestically our industries and discourage exports of agricultural products and everything else? Or do we continue to encourage exports or at least leave open those lanes for the exportation of agricultural goods and products? Well, in the end, the pro industrialists won that debate and they ended up imposing tariffs on exports of agricultural products as well as virtually everything else. And they insulated the economy from international economic activity. But that was a really disastrous policy choice for farmers because that meant that they lost access to foreign markets that they previously relied on and that made the country rich, frankly. But that was a choice that Argentina made. And the reason they made that choice was because there was a coalition of middle class workers who were well organized and unionized, who were aligned with industrialists and with the military. And as a result of this coalition assembling, Argentina imposed these protectionist measures despite the opposition of agriculture. And so, obviously, these policies, these tariffs imposed on both imports and exports, might be viewed as problematic if, for example, your country previously got rich by exporting agricultural products like Argentina. But those policy choices are themselves the product of politics. decisions made by parties, by governments, by elected officials, by whoever it is who wields the power of the state. Those decisions are political decisions. And so the politics and the policy are clearly inseparable. And we know that ISI, as a set of policies, was upheld long after its expiration date, so to speak, by precisely those social classes and those political actors who benefited from the system and who were also in a position to strike down or block any effort to change the policies. And so ISI was a set of policies that had its limitations, but the politics and the political motivations and the political and the economic interests were also clearly relevant, as were the ideas. In the end, I think that you should be prepared to assess both the political as well as the policy limitations of ISI. Understand both the politics as well as the institutions, right? The politics, the interests, as well as the policies and the different strategies involved in that bundle of policies. So as we begin to connect ISI and neoliberalism, we're bringing our attention back to those deficits and those extraordinary costs accrued by Latin American countries who increasingly had to finance development by borrowing from Western banks. So by 1980, the biggest Latin American countries had debt service costs as a percentage of exports that were absolutely astronomical. Mexico, for example, 50% of the value of its exports was equivalent to its debt service costs. That is just the cost of financing and paying down the existing debt. In Brazil, it was 63%. In Argentina, it was 37%. In Peru, it was 47%. And in Chile, it was 43%. These are unsustainable proportions. You don't ever want to be borrowing this much. The United States, as we talked about, does run deficits, as do most large industrialized countries. But those deficits don't usually get any larger than a few percent of the overall GDP. But looked at as a percentage of the value of exports, the total debt service costs look even larger. This gives you a good sense of just how sort of contradictory some of the policies were. Here they are borrowing from abroad, borrowing from Western banks primarily, US banks, European banks. They're not exporting, but they're borrowing so heavily from abroad that much of the value of their actual total exports is equivalent to what they're paying in debt service costs. So this is what these countries are facing, and suddenly they face a squeeze. This is what we might refer to as a cost squeeze, where policies begin to run aground and become unsustainable because of some of those costs or drawbacks or limitations of the model. But again, remember that these totals and these patterns are driven forward not just by the policies, but by the politics and the political actors as well. So in Argentina, the military owned and controlled and managed a lot of the biggest firms in the country. They were in the public sector and they were concentrated in steel, petrochemicals, defense. These firms were highly unprofitable and they were lethargic, zombie-like firms. But that was only the half of it. It wasn't just that they were uncompetitive and produced bad products. The military was also so powerful politically that they were basically able to just knock on the door of the treasury and get a transfer whenever they need it to cover the costs of their unprofitable zombie firms and just keep them afloat. And so that treasury wasn't just printing money. The Argentine government was borrowing from abroad. And so as a result, a large proportion of the debt accumulated by the Argentine government was accumulated under the military's control, under military rule, or accumulated in the 1980s after the transition to democracy when the military was still influential. So there's political as well as economic and policy components. The story is complicated as always. And so any effort to dismiss ISI as a flawed policy or set of policies is often going to be incomplete because the analysis must also discuss the political consequences of the policies and how those consequences themselves become part of the story. And so back in those days, the Latin American economies were primarily borrowing from the United States and Western banks, banks in those countries. But as those bills became due, and as it became necessary to service the debt, even if it just meant paying down a little bit at a time, Latin American governments were increasingly unable to pay those banks back. This is both the case with regard to governments in Latin America as well as private individuals and firms. This pattern was very destructive because it could not be sustained. And the problem was not only could it not be sustained, but those advanced economies would not lend money that could not be paid back or that did not have any chance of being paid back. And so in the 1980s, and really well before then, probably in the 1970s, frankly, maybe even the late 1960s, early 1970s, new ideas came into vogue, new theories and new approaches to the problem of what was then referred to as the developing country debt crisis, or alternatively, the Latin American debt crisis. Different ideas about how to reduce the debt burden, increase income in these countries, reduce the cost of new loans, and begin to pay down interest on some of that existing debt. And one of those ideas, or some of those ideas, began to be associated with what were referred to as structural adjustment programs. And the set of actors who promoted these SAPs, as they were called, included not just the creditors to Latin American governments like US banks, European banks, but also the IMF, the World Bank, other institutions, all became heavily involved in discussing and debating how to address this debt crisis. And by 1985, the consensus was in. That consensus was Latin American governments are too involved in their economies. Not exactly rocket science from our perspective now, but this is what they concluded. And for them, from their perspective, adjustment was necessary, in particular with regard to the role of the state in owning and controlling economic units and providing cheap credit, in imposing limitations and barriers to trade. Structural adjustment programs constituted approaches to withdrawing the state from the economy and adjusting the role of the state so that it no longer actively intervenes in the economy, but merely sort of supports private economic activity and functions as a referee that holds the institutions and the policies of a free market in place. And these structural adjustment programs would require major domestic economic reform. The idea was if these Latin American countries wanted to continue getting the loans that they need in the short, in the medium to long term, they've got to begin making serious adjustments to their economies. And these adjustments essentially revolve around withdrawing the state from the economy and sort of ejecting or sort of sending the state back to the political realm. And conditionality was the term that was placed on this. Conditionality referred to the use of conditions attached to the provision of loans, debt relief, or foreign aid by the provider to the receiving government. Basically, the idea was if you want to continue receiving loans necessary to finance consumption or development, you've got to begin undertaking major domestic economic reform in the form of a variety of changes related to reducing the role of the state. If you want more loans, if you want to reduce the amount of interest owed on existing loans, if you want to receive foreign aid, you've got to make X, Y, and Z changes. These changes went hand in hand with what's referred to as neoliberalism. And this was the return of the market, or the sort of reinvigoration of the market. This was the return of liberal economics and the emergence of an antidote to ISI's perceived limitations. So remember that ISI was first and foremost characterized by an extensive role for the state in the economy in the form of ownership and control of enterprises, particularly in heavy industry, high tariffs to both imports and exports, cheap credit, interest rates determined by the state as opposed to market forces, extensive spending, subsidies to industry, active fiscal policy, on and on and on. The state was heavily involved. Market forces, not so much, because remember that dependency theory said that developing countries are not undeveloped, they're underdeveloped vis-a-vis advanced countries, because as incomes rise, a smaller proportion of income is spent on natural resources, commodities, agricultural products, the things that are exported by developing countries. So developing countries must unplug from the world economy, and they must use the state to develop the domestic economy, chiefly through subsidizing expansion and consumption of domestically produced goods. Neoliberalism, as a strategy that involved reducing the role of the state and going in the opposite direction, involved a whole bunch of individual policies that were designed to just sort of attack each individual component of the ISI strategy. The first one was fiscal discipline or reduced spending, reduce subsidies, stop providing such cheap credit, stop spending so much in the areas where money is being spent. Similarly, there was a reordering of public expenditure priorities and a focus on basic functions that were essential and that would replace a much larger set of functions that the state previously performed. Tax reform, the idea that private actors, and in particular private investors, and those who would replace the role of the state, should enjoy lower tax rates so as to incentivize investment. Use the market to determine interest rates as opposed to the state. Use market forces of supply and demand to determine interest rates. Competitive exchange rates as opposed to those set by the state. Competitive exchange rates usually meant in practice floating exchange rates, those that are determined by supply and demand and forces in international currency markets. Trade liberalization, removing barriers to trade in the form of import and export tariffs. Facilitating the opening up of the system to foreign direct investment. So basically liberalizing the capital account, allowing transactions across borders in the movement of capital in and out of the country. allow foreign non-nationals to purchase assets, privatization, transferring the ownership of firms to the private sector, especially in large sectors with a natural monopoly like defense or steel or petrochemicals or transportation, oil, deregulation in the form of removing restrictions on businesses and prices. During the ISI period, governments were frequently involved in price setting as part of a strategy to stimulate certain kinds of activity domestically. Deregulation would mean no more of a role for the state in this regard. And then finally, property rights protection. And of course, this meant that the state would not be involved in expropriating or compensating owners for the loss of their assets in the event of a buyout or some transfer that took place. During the ISI period, because the state owned much of the economy or more of the economy, it was perceived to be the case that property rights were less protected. It is true that during the ISI period, there were laws that limited the scope of private initiative within the economy and would basically bar private actors from making investments in certain sectors. Property rights protection is understood broadly as removing those restrictions so that private initiative can be undertaken in a variety of different sectors. So for instance, in Portugal, defense goods could only be produced by state-owned firms and mainly military-owned firms. In Portugal, though, property rights protection and neoliberal reform involved sort of liberalizing and freeing up private initiative in the defense sector, just to give you an example. Let's continue watching the Commanding Heights documentary and take a look at the example of Chile. Chile is the earliest example of neoliberal reform and really set the tone and kind of set an example for Latin American countries and really the rest of the developing world. Pay close attention to the interaction between politics and economics exhibited here. That is really, really important, and it helps us to better understand the political economy of all of this.
The Chicago Boys were a group of economists at Chile's Catholic University who had been sent to the University of Chicago as exchange students. There, they absorbed the ideas of the Chicago School of Economics with its almost revolutionary belief in free markets.
What characterized Chicago School was a strong belief in minimal government and an emphasis on free market as a way to control the economy.
Professors like Arnold Harberger and Milton Friedman taught their students to mistrust state planning and government control. When the Chicago Boys returned to Chile, they brought with them ideas that were a direct challenge to the dependency theory.
This small group stayed together through the Allende years, and they used to meet, I think, every Tuesday for lunch. And they would keep kind of a running document which said how they would reform this economy, how this economy has to be reformed, what is to be done to get out of the swamp that they were putting themselves in.
Unfortunately, due to the idiosyncrasies of the military mind, the generals prefer the controlled economy. That is, an economy that would obey orders.
Javier Vial, an influential businessman, sympathetic to the junta, was trying to push the military in the direction of the free market.
So I called Milton Friedman and invite him to come to Chile.
So Milton Friedman, the most famous free market economist in the world, came to lecture in Chile.
I went down to Chile and spent 5 days giving a series of lectures on Chilean problem, particularly the problem of inflation and how they should proceed to do something about it.
Friedman's first talk was at the Catholic University. His theme, the inescapable link between free markets and freedom.
The emphasis of that talk was that free markets would undermine political centralization and political control.
He said that you cannot have a repressive government for long within a genuinely free economic system.
But Friedman was also persuaded to visit the Grim Conference Center, from which Pinochet ruled Chile. Friedman told Pinochet that he needed to take decisive and immediate action to defeat inflation.
Friedman said, well, I'm going to give you an example. If you cut the tail to a dog in pieces, step by step, you will kill the dog. This is the same as inflation. You have to cut it at once, and then the country will start moving.
Milton's presence probably helped to stiffen the spine of people who were trying to insist on better economic policies. That's the period when the takeoff of the Chilean economy really began. The major reforms were made.
The junta called on the Chicago Boys to rescue the economy. 500 state-owned businesses were privatized. Government budgets were cut. Import tariffs were swept away. The markets were given free rein.
En vez de sustituir the basic thrust was to increase exports and abolish artificial price controls.
Artificiales. Here was the first case in which you had a movement toward communism, which was replaced by a movement toward free markets.
There was much pain for the poorest. The cost of living went through the roof. The gap between rich and poor got wider and stayed that way.
They were starting a very deep process of transformation of the economy without any regard of what happened to people. And we ended up at one point in time with 30% unemployment rate.
According to the Chicago Boys, the gain was worth the pain. Chile became the fastest growing economy in Latin America.
They were able to start the process of deregulating the markets, opening up the economy. So that's their contribution. They were able to anticipate a global trend, and Chile has benefited from that.
But at a price.
At a very high price. At a very, very, believe me, at a very high human price.
The Chilean economy did very well, but more important, in the end, the Chilean military junta was replaced by a democratic society. Free markets did work their way in bringing about a free society.
This is the monument to the 2,400 people who died or disappeared during the dictatorship. The brutality of Pinochet's regime left little enthusiasm for economic change in the rest of Latin America.
The fact that the Pinochet regime was politically unsavory allowed the left to make an association between market reforms on the one hand and repressive authoritarian governments on the other. And that was a terribly damaging connection.
The intellectual elite were on the side of Allende, not on the side of Pinochet. They regarded me as a traitor for having been willing to talk in Chile.
Friedman then became a figure of hate and they organized demonstrations against him wherever he went, and this went on for a period of years.
The protests reached their climax when Friedman was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1976.
At the Nobel ceremonies in Stockholm, I was subject to abuse in the sense that there were large demonstrations against me. It was a concerted effort to tar and feather me.
In the minds of many people, the reforms in Chile were tainted by the political cast of the regime. That did set back the cause of liberal economics. It made other countries more resistant to the idea of market reforms than they otherwise would have been.
Watch all of Commanding Heights online at
Adolfo asks, so a socialist elected government was overthrown to prop up Pinochet, and the neoliberal policies favored corporate interest above the common person. So first, yes, Allende was elected and he was overthrown, but by the military, by a junta. Pinochet only emerged through the course of a power struggle within the junta in subsequent months. And so it was a collegial junta at the start. But yes, over the course of the period between 1973 and about 1988, the military regime imposed a series of neoliberal policies that were far-reaching reforms and that did essentially favor the corporate interest above the common person. This is a question that I want us to address and think about after we've just watched this video. How did neoliberal reform impact development in Chile? And I want to suggest to you that it's a mixed bag. There were both pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. What are some of the effects on development of neoliberalism in Chile based on this video?
I would say in the short run, it created more inequality, but in the long run, it created a better market-driven economy, stronger economy.
Okay, so in the short run, it created a lot of inequality, but it may have strengthened the economy in the long run. So let's take that piece by piece. So how did it increase inequality? What were some of the mechanisms that resulted in increased inequality?
I think one of the results was 30% unemployment rates that was mentioned on the video. So that created more poverty and as a result, inequality, I guess.
Yeah, so unemployment resulted from budget cuts, privatization, which usually resulted in the restructuring of firms and enterprises or their dissolution. So there was a lot of change in the labor market that resulted from the downsizing of the state and the transfer of ownership rights to the private sector. At one point, Chile had unemployment that was like 35%. What were some of the positive benefits of neoliberalism for development? Let's hear from someone apart from Rady.
If I may, Professor.
Yes, of course.
I think the big advantage of neoliberalism in Chile was the transfer of corporations to the private sector, right, from government ownership to the private sector.
So what was the sort of like big benefit of that? Like, how did that?
It allowed businesses to be more competitive and evolve in a way that they could grow and support and export goods and employ a bunch of people and start getting rid of that massive unemployment rate, all that, the negative drawbacks that initially created.
So Lucas, it sounds to me like the benefits of privatization kind of depend on cutting tariffs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe so.
So that's an example of a complementarity and a set of policies that when you package them together can be very beneficial. So you privatize very expensive, very inefficient, sluggish firms, and then you simultaneously cut tariffs. You also liberalize the capital account so that you allow private foreign investment, and so that you then allow those companies to import or export or participate in the economy however they wish. And so these policies come together as a package. And that's one of the arguments that Milton Friedman and the others made. You've got to do X, Y, and Z simultaneously. You've got to pull the Band-Aid all the way off. You can't like do a half-see type thing. You've got to cut the tail all the way off, as he put it.
Understood. And flip policy altogether.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's sort of, you don't want to get stuck in the middle, right? You want to really have a nice clean break. But this is also one part of it that becomes difficult politically, right? Because it's hard enough to privatize state industries that employ a large proportion of the working and middle classes. It's even harder to cut budgets, to cut tariffs, to liberalize the capital account, to allow interest rates to be determined by market forces. All of these things make it extraordinarily difficult politically to push through reform, because all of that together is very, very painful. And so it's not a coincidence that these neoliberal reforms were basically imposed at gunpoint. Chile was the first place in the world where this was done. And it is true that the neoliberal reforms were relatively successful in a lot of different ways in resolving some of the crises of ISI. But the political component was extraordinarily unsavory and brutal and repressive and bloody. Many would argue that neoliberal reform could not have been accomplished without that political component, that repressive, undemocratic approach to imposing these reforms. But you might also say, well, in Argentina and elsewhere in Latin America, when those reforms were eventually imposed, they were imposed by democratically elected presidents who campaigned on one policy and then pursued reforms once they actually got in office. Alondra says people used to getting the special treatment now had less power or political gain, meaning people could not take advantage of their status or government. So Alondra, what were some of the groups that had less power, or who were some of the organizations that were sort of weakened by the reforms, the neoliberal reforms? Can you think of any examples? Tell us in the chat. Rady says rapid economic growth. Christiana says, doesn't neoliberalism mainly benefit the wealthy and the powerful? Well, all economic policies tend to produce winners and losers, right? No policy affects everyone evenly. To the extent that the beneficiaries of market-driven reforms are the ones that that already own considerable assets privately, yeah, the ones who would benefit from market reforms would be the ones who would be well-heeled and well-positioned to sort of self-provide, if you will. On the other hand, unions, the military, other institutions that relied on a large state in a big state for either budgets or their economic privileges, those actors were weakened and were hurt by ISI. Ernie says, as we saw in the video, the concept of neoliberalism in the long run had a positive effect on Chile's economy, even if in the beginning there were setbacks. It may not have been the ideal way to get the country's economy up there like it was explained in the video. So, as you're all noticing quite astutely, there were pros and cons, right? Neoliberalism was really effective at reducing inflation by cutting spending, by letting interest rates be market determined, by transferring assets to the private sector. It reduced the role of the state. And although that also resulted in a lot of unemployment because of less spending and less money in the economy, it also resulted in lower inflation rates, in a lower tendency for the price structure to rise. So in that regard, neoliberalism was a success, but it also contributed to an increase in inequality precisely because of that unemployment, and because of the way in which neoliberal reform tended to benefit those private actors who were in the position to buy state enterprises or who were in the position to really push their weight around in a totally or a mostly free market. Now, who were those actors? Well, they were foreign companies, foreign investors, but they were also a set of families and narrow interests in Chile who already owned and controlled much of the private enterprise in the economy. And so most of the firms were bought by foreign nationals when they were privatized, but a lot of them were also bought by domestic nationals and those families that I've mentioned before. And so neoliberalism, it reduced inflation, but it increased inequality. It did help to stabilize the economy. It did help to eventually set the tone for a return to democratic rule. But here's the thing. Milton Friedman's wrong when he says that neoliberalism caused democratic transition in Chile. It is true that neoliberalism precipitated the transition, but only because people were so fed up and sick of neoliberal reform that they sent the military regime packing in a referendum held to determine whether Pinochet would stay in power or not. And so it's not technically totally honest to say that neoliberal reform precipitated democracy because neoliberal reform was so successful and so effective. In fact, in the mid 1980s, Chile had a deep economic crisis that resulted partly from the way in which neoliberal reform was implemented. So people were fed up with neoliberal reform and they were fed up with the military and they wanted democracy. Adolfo says, seems like this needs to use neoliberal reforms gives more evidence for the dependency model. So this is what's interesting. This causes us to sit back and think about, well, what were some of the potential benefits of ISI? And what did dependency theory get right? Well, one thing that they got right is recognizing that in developing countries, the state is often the only actor with the capacity to harness and to channel the capital necessary to promote industrialization. Now, the politics that results from that process is a separate question. But the role of the state is indisputable in a developing country when it comes to developing the economy. It's just that we need to figure out where to draw the line, right? How much state is too much? How much private sector is too much? Where do we sort of meet in the middle? And how do we make sure that we do it in a way that the policies are coherent enough that they work as a package and that they work in a complementary way so as to promote development and not inhibit it? Listen, everybody, as always, we've had a good discussion. We'll continue discussing neoliberalism on Wednesday, and I'll have the review guide for you later today. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you on Wednesday.